If you were to conduct a poll right now among Pokemon fans, I feel quite confident that the Generation 5 games, Pokemon Black and White and their sequels, would be voted as the best games in the series. People love their characters, their story themes are often praised, the games probably have the most content and longest post-game in the series, many consider them the graphical peak, and mechanically they are the last titles before the gimmick craze started in X and Y, which makes the Gen 5 games feel more evergreen. Not to mention that they are easy to use for the many kinds of popular challenge runs. And so, it can be a bit of a surprise to hear that when they were first released, Pokemon Black and White were quite unpopular. Not only are Black and White the worst selling new generations in the entire franchise, Black and White 2 are probably the worst selling third versions as well, as although Emerald, Crystal and Platinum technically sold less, those are only one game, so there is a decent chance that if you deduct people who bought both, the Gen 5 sequels are actually the worst selling mainline Pokemon games of all time. And even if we do follow the actual numbers, Gen 5 is quite comfortably the worst selling generation of all time, not counting Gen 6 for only being one game. And that feels crazy to say, right? We've heard so much criticism over recent Pokemon games, the sentiment around the series has never felt so negative, and yet Scarlet and Violet has sold nearly double what Black and White did. What really made people stop buying Pokemon games wasn't poor graphics, weak performance or glitches. It was releasing the games many consider to be the series' peak. Let's take a look back at how Black and White have gone from Pokemon's closest thing to a flop ever to the people's favorite. Now, usually when you have a good product but disappointing sales, the place to cast a critical look at is marketing. You can have the greatest game ever, but if your means of advertising it suck, or you're plagued by poor PR, that can seriously hurt your sales. And Pokemon is definitely no stranger to poor PR, think Dexit for example, or poor marketing like Sun and Moon's rollout, which spoiled basically the entire game, or Legends Arceus' first trailer trying to draw comparisons to Breath of the Wild when, graphically, it looks a lot worse. But the thing is, this wasn't really the case for Black and White. You could argue the marketing was a little traditional, as it relied quite a lot on media forms that the public started trading in for the internet around the early 2010s, like TV shows and physical magazines, but that's easy to say in hindsight, knowing what we know now. And at the time, Pokemon was definitely also getting its fair share of debates and cultural moments on the internet forums and social media platforms of the time. The highlight were the silhouettes of the starters, which sent the fanbase into a frenzy trying to figure out what their actual designs could be, with this one actually being the fan favorite until the real one was revealed and we are still left yearning for the platypus with the acorn on its head all these years later. Point being, the disappointing sales definitely weren't the result of low visibility, of people simply not knowing or caring that a new Pokemon title was coming. And it should go without saying that the system probably wasn't the cause either, as the Nintendo DS was a huge success for Nintendo, and especially at the time when Black and White released, it felt like everyone had one. So we can scratch those off the list of possibilities for the poor reception and sales. They're not guilty, and let's instead move on to the prime suspect, the one you've probably heard mentioned as the #1 reason: the Pokemon roster. We've seen with Dexit that people really don't like it when Game Freak takes their fan favorites away. It's exactly that kind of bond that has made Pokemon the biggest media franchise in the world, but it's a nightmare to manage when you make the decisions like the one made in Black and White. Not featuring a single old Pokemon in the main playthrough of the game. Sure, you could still bring them in later when you finish the game, but for the vast majority of people that didn't matter. They wanted their favorites and they wanted to play the actual story with them, not with the copycats that Unova introduced. Because yeah, that is definitely another part of the problem here. The large amount of Pokemon introduced in Gen 5 that feel a little too close to what we've seen before. It caused a sentiment that I can best describe as fear. Fear for replacement. Say you were a Tauros mega fan. Not only could you not get Tauros in Black and White whatsoever, Unova now also has a Pokemon that appears to directly replace Tauros in Bouffaland. And now I'm using an example of a Pokemon that isn't super popular or anything, but don't forget Black and White also has what were back then seen as alternatives for fan favorites like Psyduck, Machamp, the Hitmon's, Lucario and more. The Pokemon that felt more original also appeared to follow a bit of a different design philosophy, which Game Freak described as an attempt to create more cool designs with sharper lines and edges. So not only did Black and White not have the old Pokemon everyone had grown to love, it also appeared to replace them directly and take the series' core design philosophy in a different direction, one that resulted in less of what you could call cute Pokémon, despite that having been one of the core reasons why Pokémon became such a success in the first place compared to contemporaries who focused more on cool designs from the get-go. All of these are pretty fair and understandable reasons as to why sections of the usual Pokémon fanbase might have decided not to buy the game, but just because the reasons are understandable doesn't mean they are true. And if you had asked me, say, 10 years ago when Sun and Moon released, why Black and White underperformed, I would have said this was the main reason. But today, in 2025, I'm not so sure. And the reason for that is Dexit. This was Black and White's no returning Pokémon policy dialed up to 11, 100 even you could say. Widespread outcry, major controversy, calls for boycotts. People were, and some still are, mad about this. But did it affect sales? No, not really. Sword and Shield sold incredibly well, so it didn't phase its performance whatsoever, leading me to the conclusion that while this is an issue people are vocal about, it's not necessarily a reason why they wouldn't buy a new Pokémon game. And sure, it is possible that Black and White's hard shift turned those people off so much they left the fanbase outright, meaning they are no longer a potential buyer by the time Sword and Shield released, or people claim to care about every Pokémon returning, but what they really care about are Pikachu, Eevee and Charizard, all of which aren't in Black and White, but are in Sword and Shield. But personally, I don't think the Pokémon availability problems of Black and White are the main reason why it underperformed. And for what it's worth, none of the reviews from media outlets from this time mention it as a problem either. Instead, they all bring up a different problem they have with Black and White. I have read every relevant review from media outlets dating back to 2011, and no matter whether they give the game raving reviews or middling, one thing that shows up in nearly each and every article is, it's nothing new. And that's an interesting conclusion if you ask me, because most fans would say that both Gen 5 games stand alone on a pinnacle when it comes to the sheer amount of content on offer. And sure, if you reduce Pokémon to simply catching and fighting with little monsters to collect all gym badges, Black and White are more of the same. But there are also a lot of things these games do differently and newly introduced. So then why do nearly all these reviews see Black and White more as a repackage of what already existed rather than the groundbreaking entry they're viewed as today? Well, I think a part of that comes from another negative thing Black and White did first that we have by now become used to, but back then wasn't really that common. The removing of past features. Up until Gen 4, Pokémon really only grew. New things were added and they stuck. Gen 2 added breeding and shinies and those were kept going forward. Gen 3 added contests, secret bases and the Battle Frontier, and all of those returned in some shape or form in Gen 4 as well. But Gen 5 removed, for example, secret bases and the Battle Frontier. For the first time, Pokémon was taking steps back in certain areas to take steps forward in others. And while that is something that we are completely accustomed to now, at the time it made Black and White feel less like a new, bigger Pokémon adventure and more so just a different Pokémon adventure. And while some reviews do still call this the most definitive Pokémon game and the complete package, many carry a certain undertone of, this is a must-play if you like Pokémon. And that may sound like a familiar tone nowadays, but back then, Pokémon games were must-plays in general. Not just for Pokémon fans, they were easily among the best games on every system that had them. And let me just clarify, this is not me judging Black and White or agreeing or disagreeing with these reviews. This is me highlighting the sentiment around Pokémon at the time. Ever since Red and Blue, this series has been one of gaming's biggest. It was around this time that people started to get a little tired of it. That's also just evident and makes perfect sense when you simply look at demographics. Pokémon has always managed to find its way to new generations of children. That's why it's still the mega brand it is today. But especially at the time, a lot of the core Pokémon fanbase had been with the series since its inception, since Pokémania altered the brain chemistry of millions of children worldwide. And when Black and White were released, those kids were now in their early to late teens, maybe early 20s. Not many 18-year-olds enjoy the same things they did when they were 5. And Pokémon struggled with that around this time, especially seeing as this was the era where everyone wanted realistic and mature games. It's how Zelda fans completely overlooked one of the series' best titles with Wind Waker. It's how Smash Bros made it so you could see the denim on Mario's overalls in Brawl. And even though Black and White's story is easily the most mature it had been up until that point, Pokémon still struggled to reach out to those lifelong fans. For them, removing their childhood Pokémon or previous existing features mattered. Anecdotally, I can't say I was against the lack of all Pokémon or that the cut features bothered me, but I did definitely agree that Black and White was where the Pokémon formula started to feel, well, formulaic. Another game where you do the exact same thing you do in every game wasn't enough to warrant a purchase for some of those previously loyal fans. And yet, Sword and Shield or X and Y didn't have the same problems. They both outsold Black and White despite worse PR, the same structure, similar number of older fans, and in X and Y's case, being on a less popular system to boot. And the reason for that, the real reason why Black and White underperformed, is because it had no hook. Black and White's reason to warrant you to buy it is that it's another Pokémon game. Sure, graphically it was a clear step up from Diamond and Pearl, but that isn't enough to convince people to buy. If it was, Scarlet and Violet would have done a whole lot worse. You often hear nowadays that Pokémon will always sell because it's Pokémon, and to an extent that is of course correct. A certain number of people, a not insignificant number at that, will always buy the new Pokémon game. But make no mistake, there is still a decent chunk of the potential buyers that have to be convinced. And Black and White have essentially nothing to convince people. It's a new region with new gyms, new starters, new characters, but that's it. If you were getting tired of Pokémon at this point, Black and White did nothing to reel you back in. Now compare that to X and Y. In my opinion, this is the largest gap in game-to-game quality in the series. Black and White are among my favorite Pokémon games, and I think X and Y is the weakest. And yet, I can totally see why people would be more interested in buying X and Y compared to Black and White. You've got a completely new and different art style with the series moving into 3D, and while this may be harsh to hear for the viewers who wish Pokémon would go back to the pixel art of the prior titles, but for the majority of players, 3D is preferred in any game, Pokémon included, so that alone would have caused some people who have moved on, because they consider the games to be too childish, to bat an eye again. Then you have the new Fairy type, a clear shake-up to the traditional type system which went untouched for decades. And the introduction of Mega Evolution, which is a very clear and obvious hook. Not only does it do the exact opposite of Black and White, and rather than exclude old Pokémon, makes them a core selling point, it also shakes out battling in a very important way, to an extent Black and White simply don't. Yeah, it introduced triple battles, but absolutely no one was buying the game for that, let's be real here. We nowadays consider Mega Evolution, Z-moves, Dynamaxing and Terrestrializing to be gimmicks, and maybe they are, but what they also undoubtedly are hooks. Hooks for people to get interested in, hooks to convey this is not the same Pokémon game as you played a few years ago. And that is what Black and White did wrong. It's more of the same. Brilliantly so, might I add, which is exactly why discourse about it has completely changed over the years, as obviously having a hook only matters during the game's actual release window. Afterwards, it's a non-issue. But don't let people tell you that, I don't know, the terrible designs of Gen 5 are what caused the game to underperform, or that Game Freak was scared away from including deep post-games or serious stories because Gen 5 underperformed. No one was not buying these games because they had Trubbish and Vanillite, and Game Freak very much figured out why Gen 5 failed and immediately corrected it in Gen 6, causing sales to pick up again. And it wasn't removing the post-game or making Team Flare a bunch of goofballs, it was Mega Evolution, a new graphical style, the Fairy type, character customization, Pokémon and me. Changes that were actually substantial and that would convey clearly to everyone who could hear it, this is a different Pokémon game, not just a rehash, not more of the same. And say what you want about the quality of the games going forward, this is something Pokémon has fiercely done ever since Black and White. Every game has a clear identity with several obvious new hooks that make it instantly stand out from past games. And again, whether you like those hooks or not doesn't really matter that much. That's all discourse for later, that's not what Black and White struggled with. Its legacy is fine, it's stellar in fact. It was merely the instant reception, the release window, the time that Gen 5 was actually around, that these games were poorly received. I feel like I don't need to ask you how you feel about Gen 5, so let me instead ask you this. Why do you think Gen 5 was initially a bit of a flop? especially if you were around at the time and maybe felt the same way I did. Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Pokemon content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.